Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another History of Tomorrow in 14 Points Daily. Well, with the American election a week away, I guess I can't avoid that topic entirely, but I'm going to come at it from a different angle than you're used to in order to challenge you to think about the meaning of what's going on. And so today I'm going to talk about American foreign policy and what it is that you're going to encounter in the history of tomorrow. So the history of now provides a compendium of the five cardinal cultures and their relationships. So namely, the United States acting as world police power, a post-communist Russia and post-Maoist China attempting to maintain their cardinality, and then the two unusual amalgams that are the European Union and the Islamic world, also attempting to maintain their loyalty to a certain set of fundamental values that bind them together as a cultural bloc. Once that context is set, the opportunity arises to investigate American foreign policy in the modern age, which is a policy that is a response to the various entanglements that the United States essentially foist upon itself. And so it's an important and difficult challenge using the method of constructs in order to figure out what is the significance of the events that have transpired since World War II in particular. Now, the conventional telling of the history of American foreign policy focuses, of course, on the Cold War, and then a kind of layover, a kind of strange moment where there was an indeterminacy pertaining to the nature of history, and there were even pronouncements made about the end of history. But then, of course, the attacks of 9/11 happened, and then the war on terror started. So most people looking at American foreign policy just kind of group these things as the Cold War, it's anti-communism, and then the modern era is kind of a indeterminate state, and then, of course, this new great challenge arises in the form of terrorism. The problem with this, there are many problems with this kind of common sense interpretation of the history of foreign policy. And the main one is that it's not sufficiently abstract. There isn't a proper integration of all of the various axes of America's foreign policy entanglements into a single integrated mental whole. The only way to do that is to engage in construct formation, and that is very deliberately and systematically undertaken in the history of tomorrow. So what you will see there is you will see that I identify four axes of political entanglement, beginning with what I call the Euro-Russian axis, and then the East Asian axis, and then the Cuban axis, that I isolate as a specific case of America's entanglements with Latin America, and then the Middle Eastern axis. And when you study American foreign policy along these axes, it's a form of sub-periodization. It's a form of taking periods and then analyzing them along different axes, as it were. I keep going back to that word, but basically both in terms of lengthwise, what's going on, and chopping that up into chapters, but also in terms of crosswise subdivision, essentially allowing you to see how the themes evolve separately. And they most certainly do. And what we find is that anti-communism was replaced by the toleration of communism in relation to China, Vietnam, and Cuba. So we have the East Asian axis and the Cuban axis of foreign policy tilting in the direction of the toleration of communism, of course, culminating in Barack Obama's visit to Cuba and the whole pitch that he made for putting the Cold War behind America and Cuba in their relations. So that's an important component. Those are two important components: the toleration of communism in relation to East Asia and the toleration of communism in relation to Cuba are two of the components that are necessary to form a proper integration of American foreign policy in the current age. But then comes the more difficult problem of what is the meaning of America's foreign policy in relation to the Middle East and in relation to the primary, which is the Euro-Russian axis. And what we find is that in relation to the Middle East, we have the toleration. Again, that's a key word. We have the toleration, in this case, of Islamism. So we're seeing a common denominator, a kind of tolerationism, if you will, that definitely characterizes foreign policy across the board. However, then we get to the final axis, which is Europe and Russia, and we see the exact opposite, seemingly. What we see is the trend of NATO expansionism and the obvious exacerbation of the tension between America and Russia over Eastern Europe, culminating in the Russia-Ukraine war. And there what we see is an America first policy, which was started under Bill Clinton, which basically said that peace with Russia was not the goal. Essentially, preventing a future Euro-Russian union became the goal. Once that was identified, then America's foreign policy became hyper-focused on maintaining primacy. And the United States began major expansions of NATO in lockstep with the expansions of the European Union in order to prevent America from becoming irrelevant to European security. And as that continued, it became obvious that Russia was waning and was afraid of the geopolitical consequences of what America was doing. And so they lodged many protests. And then we have the entire sequence that occurs from 2014 with the American-led coup against the Ukrainian government, and then all of the subsequent events which led to the Russia-Ukraine war. And what we see there is America acting in order, fundamentally, to uphold and further its own primacy. Which is why when you put these things together properly, and I'm giving you the short treatment, of course, here, but when you put these things together properly, what you get is an America first multiculturalism foreign policy. The construct, America first multiculturalism, is a fundamentally incongruous and incoherent idea. Foreign policy, sadly, has been characterized by that sort of problem along the way pretty much all the time. Except, of course, when the founders were consistent in maintaining political separation in the defense of rights. So I trace that development. I show how the founding fathers thought about foreign policy, how that was abandoned, first in the Spanish-American War and then ultimately in World War I. And what the consequences of that have been, with America entangled across the board and leading to this very strange policy of America first multiculturalism. For more, I refer you to The History of Tomorrow. Regardless of whether or not Kamala Harris or Donald Trump is elected, a foreign policy of America first multiculturalism will continue to prevail. So that's one of the items for you to consider as you're deciding what to do in the upcoming election. Good luck to you. You'll need it.